What is at stake in the current debate on the question of freedom of expression that's going on in our country today? The stakes involved are pretty high. They're not new, but they're very high and they are very interesting. So I feel that the debate itself is to be welcomed. One of the stakes involved is the right of free citizens in a democratic society to fearlessly and publicly express their views on matters of common interest. On the other hand, there is also the right of equal citizens in a democratic state not to be publicly insulted or demeaned through media representations or stereotypes that do them harm as a community. There is also the duty of the democratic state to facilitate, to promote the freedom of expression of all citizens without fear of retribution on the one hand, and on the other hand, the responsibility of the same state to ensure that certain social groups, especially socially vulnerable minorities, are not subjected to prejudiced forms of stereotyping or hate speech. How might we try and go beyond the absolutist blinkered positions that are dominant in the media today? Positions that assert that if you are not for free speech as an absolute value, then you are somehow for a police state of the Stalinist or Talibanist variety. Is there something beyond this way of framing the debate? The position adopted by a large number of well-known and perhaps well-meaning intellectuals in relation to the assumptions and views recently expressed by Professor Ashish Nandy at Jaipur and later on in Delhi is fairly problematic. They're problematic not merely because of their defense of the flippant comments and the unconvincing clarifications issued later by Nandy and his friends, but also problematic because of the refusal to see any merit or justice in the range of negative responses from Dalits as well as from other concerned critics. Yogendra Yadav, for instance, faults the Dalit response to Nandy as censorship and not social justice, and says that the real tragedy today is that Dalits are unable to recognize their true friends. Lawrence Liang, whose views we respect a great deal in matters of law and media, has characterized those who object to Nandy as having huffed and puffed to a point of breathlessness. He offers them the medical advice that this affects their ability to hear properly and issues a general warning that while Nandy is paying a heavy price for his speech, the real casualty of the entire affair will be our collective ability to listen fearlessly, and genuine speech will be held in perpetual ransom by those who infantilize and trivialize our public sphere. So, we need to ask whether Indian society today is really besieged by what the media has taken to calling cultural terrorism. If so, are Ashish Nandy, Salman Rushdie and Kamal Haasan the only representative victims of such cultural terrorism? And are Dalits or Muslims the only ones who are unable to hear properly and are trivializing our public sphere? That is the question before us. It would be worth our while to briefly revisit Lawrence's 2004 essay titled Reasonable Restrictions and Unreasonable Speech, which seem very relevant for the discussions today. Many of us have used it in our class, and it has clarified many things related to the current discussion on free speech and the role of the state. In this essay, Liang has historicized the conditions under which, the reasons for which the First Amendment was introduced to the Indian Constitution. What the First Amendment to the Indian Constitution in 1951 sought to do was to impose a set of reasonable restrictions on the freedom of expression in the interests of other values that were deemed to be crucial for the emergent nation state. Dr. Ambedkar, who took on the questions and the criticisms that many other members of Indian, noting that the primary impetus for introducing the First Amendment was the state's interest to act by what it deemed to be public order, as well as friendly relations with other countries, Lawrence Liang sees the First Amendment as a premature end to the democratic vision that characterized the new republic. Curiously, Liang appears to ignore some of the concerns that were articulated by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar at the time of the discussion on the First Amendment. We should remember the context in which the First Amendment was introduced and the remarks that Ambedkar made to other members of the House. At the beginning of the debate, he had expressed certain disagreements with certain rulings that the Supreme Court had come out with, and these related to two primary issues. One was related to the reservation of jobs for SCs and STs in government jobs and in educational institutions. And the other concerned the incitement to violence against certain social and religious groups that were taking place in the context of the post-partition situation in India. Now, the Supreme Court had ruled that because of the existence of freedom of expression, the state did not have the power to impose any limitations on such speech that was seen as offensive or leading to public disorder or the breakdown in social amity or tranquility. And the importance was that the Parliament had to come and assert its responsibility, its duty to maintain not just public order but also social tranquility. So this is the context in which Ambedkar was at pains to emphasize that free speech or freedom of expression did not include the right to incite violence in society. Now, when others asked him about how he would define violence, that the state should stop short of freedom of expression of views that would only lead to violence, Ambedkar was asking others to think about how violence is to be defined in India. So he was giving two examples which clarified how he thought of violence. One example was of the threat or the appeal to other castes. So one concerned the question of incitement to violence in the form of social boycott of the scheduled caste by high caste Hindus. Ambedkar was especially concerned about two instances in which there had been an incitement to violence against the scheduled castes. He gave the example of upper caste Hindus calling for a social boycott of scheduled castes who had done something which they did not approve of. And he said that the constitution had to make clear that this could not be encouraged or allowed. So there had to be some regulation which would stop the appeals to social boycott of scheduled castes in the interest of equality. And the other example he gave was when upper caste Hindus incited certain other people to poison the well that was declared open by the courts for public use, including the scheduled castes. So in these two instances, Ambedkar was concerned that there had to be a definition of what violence was, and the incitement to such violence was a matter of great concern for the Indian state. It was a concern that the Indian state couldn't walk away from. I find it curious that Lawrence Liang, in his otherwise very perceptive and important essay, misses out this point, where he emphasizes that foreign relations and public order was the overriding concern. How is it that he misses out in the same debate the concerns expressed by Dr. Ambedkar? So we may say that the Constitution is not merely a dry book of rules and regulations about what citizens should or should not do. We can also see it as a form of agreement on certain basic principles. I mean, there were a lot of divisions, but it was a social contract or an agreement which brought into being the Indian Republic in 1951. The significance of this is that had these agreements, had these compromises not been struck between, say, for the upper caste Hindus and the scheduled caste, between the dominant Hindu community and the Muslim minorities, if these compromises and these agreements had not been struck, it is debatable whether the Indian nation itself would have come into being in 1951. So this is what lies at the heart of the Indian Constitution. The point I'm making is, instead of seeing the First Amendment to the Indian Constitution as a failure of the Indian democratic revolution, we may actually see it as a continuation, as a deepening of certain social concerns that have led to the deepening of democracy in this country. The notion of freedom of expression builds on certain crucial and inspiring ideas that have been written about and debated extensively following the works of John Stuart Mill, John Milton, and the decision given by Justice Holmes, where there is talk of truth resulting as a result of competition in the marketplace of ideas. There is the idea that free speech in itself is a natural right which should not be violated by the state or by society. There is also the idea that truth needs to be spoken publicly and fearlessly so that, in competition with contending views, it can lead to improvement in knowledge as well as social progress. So this is what lies at the heart of the debate on the freedom of expression debate. The question that has surfaced in recent times is whether hate speech and the right to offend is a form of legitimate speech that needs to be defended, or should it be seen as a form of harassment and intimidation that needs to be regulated by the state in the interest of other important social values. It has been pointed out that hate speech, rather than contribute to the emergence and the deepening of truth, actually leads to women and religious minorities and other socially vulnerable social groups to withdraw into silence and withdraw from participation in society. And given this, it has been argued that the state has a responsibility to regulate hate speech and to place limits on it, rather than see this as a coterminous with the right to freedom of expression. The question is not merely whether hate speech or media stereotypes or other forms of offensive representations depict violence against the minorities. The argument is that it actually does violence to the minorities because of the consequences it has on preventing them from speaking confidently in public, from participating in public as free and equal citizens. So the thing is not about media misrepresentations and depictions, but of the actual consequences, the actual practice of violence involved in hate speech or offensive speech acts. It is also argued, and rightly so, that the proper functioning of the marketplace of ideas requires parity in terms of access to the media and in terms of other public spaces and the frameworks within which certain truths can be understood. The standard media practice, for example, of calling 3 or 4 different spokespeople of different social groups and asking them to explain their viewpoint and giving them 10 or 15 seconds each is problematic, because a person who articulates the dominant social prejudices or the dominant viewpoints in society, he is able to effectively use those 10 or 15 seconds in order to articulate a commonsensical viewpoint, a hegemonic viewpoint, which most members of the audience are likely to agree with. However, a person who is coming up with something which is not very widely known, something which is important, but is coming out of a social critique of dominant representations, and to give such a spokesperson also 10 minutes is not ensuring parity of access, and it leads to a skewed way of somebody having won the debate through the use of reason and freedom of expression. This notion of freedom of expression does not actually promote the interest of truth as is claimed by its proponents. The point here is that freedom of expression requires parity of access, socially vulnerable. Let us consider the other 2 recent examples that are being much discussed. Actor-director Kamal Haasan makes a slick action thriller, reportedly with scenes in which the Muslim community is shown to indulge in religiously inspired acts of terror, or at least to condone such acts that is happening in the name of Islam. Many Muslims, and not just Muslims, find this kind of stereotyping bigoted and offensive. The standard argument has been that Kamal Haasan as a filmmaker should have the right to express his views in public, even if these views are deemed offensive by some, but that Muslim viewers do not seem to have the right to take offense, except in the form of staying away from the theaters where such views are being communicated to large numbers of people, or writing polished articles in the forums that are available to them or acceptable to them. So, one side is supposed to have the right to express its views in public. The other side can only ignore such speech acts or respond to them through protocols that favor and are favored by the first side. Let's take case number 2. The politician Akbaruddin Owaisi makes a 2-hour speech which is primarily an exhaustive catalogue of criticisms about the injustices that were done to the Muslim community in recent times in Gujarat, in Kashmir, in Ayodhya, in the Northeast, in the non-implementations of the recommendations by the Sachar Commission regarding jobs for Muslims in the public sector, in the impunity with which the police has been going around arresting innocent Muslim youths and keeping them in custody for a long time, in the government allowing a Hindu temple to be built adjacent to the Charminar structure in the old city of Hyderabad. Along with this very exhaustive and depressing catalogue of the list of wrongs that are done to the Muslim community, Akbaruddin Owaisi also expresses anger and anguish at the double standards with which the state and the community at large has responded to the wrongs done to the Muslim community. By and large, one notices that the media did not actually report on the primary arguments that Akbaruddin Owaisi made and concentrated instead on the rhetorical flourishes, which were actually not very different from those indulged in by other politicians. Akbaruddin Owaisi was dubbed a hate monger, and a campaign was started for his immediate arrest, and the state government in Andhra Pradesh obliged because it suited its present political purposes. I am not really interested in the distinction between Akbaruddin Owaisi and Praveen Togadia. Although, personally speaking, having listened to both of them express their views about what is wrong with our nation today, I tend to agree more with Akbaruddin Owaisi's critique of the ills of Indian society than Praveen Togadia's. The distinction that really interests me is the one involved in our assumption that we need to defend the freedom of expression, including the right to give offense, of certain artists and intellectuals in the name of democracy and social progress, but that we need to curtail the freedom of expression and the right to take offense of politicians and social activists who do not agree with our self-serving and patronizing ideas of what democracy and social progress involve. So, the assumption that one side has the right to offend, the other side basically has the duty to tolerate the offense. In other words, the deeper democratic question that confronts us today is that who or which social class gets to define the Lakshman Rekha about what is permissible and not permissible in our society. Which social class gets to impose this definition of its Lakshman Rekha on the rest of society? Which social class gets to decide which transgressions of the law are to be tolerated and which ones not tolerated? Freedom of expression is indeed very important for personal dignity and social progress. But then, so are the rights of the minorities to participate equally and effectively in public forums and to experience the benefit of personal dignity and social progress. Why should we assume that one right is more important than the other, or that one right will automatically lead to the other, or that even that one right can be achieved without achieving the other? These are real and hard and important questions for our republic today, and we must try not to trivialize them with ready-made solutions from other contexts.